August 4th, 1936. Billy Cross was 19 years old when he walked into that back room at the Olympic Village in Berlin. Jesse Owens was supposed to be there. Instead, Billy found 3 SS officers waiting with a single photograph and a choice that would haunt him for the next 87 years. The photograph showed Jesse's family back in Cleveland, his wife, his young daughters. The officers didn't need to explain what would happen if Jesse kept winning medals in front of Hitler's master race theory. Billy had 60 seconds to decide. Save his best friend and mentor, or watch the greatest athlete who ever lived disappear into the night. What Billy said in that room changed everything. The Nazis got what they wanted. Jesse lived to become legend. And for nearly 9 decades, only one person knew the real reason why Hitler refused to shake Jesse Owens' hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's arthritis screamed as he lifted the canister from behind the dusty boxes. 87 years old, and his hands still remembered the weight of secrets. The metal was cold against his palms, unchanged since that sweltering August day in Berlin when the world watched Jesse Owens make history. But they hadn't seen what Frank saw through his viewfinder. The apartment around him felt smaller in the pre-dawn darkness, walls closing in like the concrete bunkers he'd photographed during the war. Towers of National Geographic magazines created narrow pathways between rooms, boxes of undeveloped film, decades of moments frozen in silver halide, lined every available surface. His life's work, or maybe his life's burden. Frank carried the canister to his kitchen table, clearing space among pill bottles and yesterday's untouched dinner. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that reminded him of the stadium lights that night. The night Jesse made his choice. The phone rang again. Frank stared at it, his pulse hammering against his ribs. 4 rings, 5. The answering machine clicked on, his own voice, gravelly with age. "You've reached Frank Morrison. Leave a message." "Mr. Morrison, this is Dr. Elena Richter calling from Berlin. I know you're there. We need to discuss what I've found in the Bundesarchiv." The footage is quite clear. Jesse Owens, August 4th, 1936. The Adlon Hotel. Heinrich Müller. A pause. "I have 36 hours before my documentary airs on the History Channel. Call me." The line went dead. Frank's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the linoleum. Brown liquid spread toward his slippered feet like spilled blood. Heinrich Müller. Christ, she even knew about Müller. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in decades. Gestapo Müller, they'd called him. The butcher who disappeared after the war, whose cruelty was legend even among Nazis. The man who'd cornered Jesse in that hotel corridor with an offer no father could refuse. Frank's neighbor's dog started barking through the thin walls, Mrs. Chen's ancient Pomeranian who yapped at shadows. But this felt different, urgent. Frank moved to his window, peering through yellowed Venetian blinds at the street below. Empty. Too empty for a Tuesday morning in Pilsen. A black sedan idled at the corner under a broken streetlight. Frank's breath fogged the glass. Paranoia was an old man's disease, he told himself. But in his business, in his real business, the one that paid for this apartment and kept him fed, paranoia kept you alive. He'd photographed mob trials, corporate whistleblowers, politicians with blood on their hands. He'd made enemies. But this felt older, deeper. The canister seemed to pulse with malevolent energy on his kitchen table. He'd carried this secret through Korea, through Vietnam, through the Reagan years and 9/11, and every historical moment since. He'd watched Jesse become a legend, watched him struggle with poverty, watched him die in 1980 without ever speaking of that night. And Frank had kept his promise. Until 3 hours ago, he'd been the only living soul who knew what Jesse Owens had really done to protect his family. The deal he'd struck, the price he'd paid for his daughter's safety in a world where black children disappeared and nobody asked questions. Frank returned to the table and unscrewed the canister's lid. Inside, nestled in darkness, lay strips of 35mm film, negatives that could topple monuments, rewrite textbooks, destroy the legacy of America's greatest Olympic hero. images of Jesse accepting an envelope from a man in an SS uniform, audio recordings, if they still existed, of promises made and souls sold. The world needed heroes, especially now, when everything decent seemed to be crumbling. Jesse Owens represented hope, triumph over hatred, the power of excellence to transcend prejudice. Frank had spent 8 decades protecting that narrative, but Dr. Elena Richter had found her own evidence. Nazi archives the Americans hadn't destroyed or hidden, film footage that would show the world what Frank had seen: Jesse Owens, greatest athlete of his generation, shaking hands with a monster to save his children. Frank pulled out the first strip of negatives, holding it to the buzzing fluorescent light. Shadows and shapes, reversed images that would reveal their secrets only in the developer's chemical bath. He'd built a darkroom in his bedroom closet 30 years ago, had everything he needed to process film from any era. The question was whether he should. His chest tightened. Angina, his doctor called it. Stress, as if Frank needed medical terminology for the weight of carrying history's ugliest truths. He popped a nitroglycerin tablet under his tongue and tasted the familiar burn. The black sedan was still there. Frank made his decision. If Elena Richter was going to expose Jesse's secret, she'd do it with incomplete evidence. Half-truths that left room for doubt, for alternative explanations. But if she got Frank's photographs, the complete record of what happened at the Adlon Hotel, there would be no denying the truth. Jesse Owens, American hero, had made a deal with the devil, and Frank Morrison, keeper of secrets, was the only man alive who could prove it. Frank's hands trembled as he set the negatives down, the weight of decades pressing against his sternum like a physical thing. The apartment suddenly felt fragile around him, walls that had protected his secrets for 30 years now seeming thin as tissue paper. Through the kitchen window, morning light crept across Chicago's South Side, illuminating the life he'd built from silence and compromise. He moved through rooms that told the story of a man who'd spent his career capturing other people's truths while burying his own. Wedding photographs from the 50s lined one hallway, young couples frozen in black and white joy, their children now grandparents themselves. Corporate headshots from the 70s filled another wall, executives who'd paid handsomely for Frank's discretion when their empires crumbled. His legitimate work, the photography that paid bills and maintained cover for deeper secrets. But it was the shrine in his living room that revealed Frank's true vulnerability. A corner table held 3 framed photographs. Maria Morrison, his wife of 43 years, dead now 8 winters. Her smile radiant in their wedding portrait, her eyes still bright in the last photo he'd taken of her at Northwestern Memorial, even as cancer hollowed her cheeks. Between them sat a picture of their daughter, Sarah, graduation day at Northwestern, her journalism degree held high like a banner of hope. Sarah, who'd inherited Maria's stubborn streak and Frank's eye for hidden truths. Sarah, who'd built her own career exposing corruption at the Chicago Tribune until a stroke at 52 left her speaking in fragments, her brilliant mind trapped behind damaged synapses. Sarah, who lived now in a care facility in Evanston, who still recognized her father on good days, who would be destroyed if the world learned what Frank Morrison had done in the name of protecting heroes. Frank touched Sarah's photograph with fingers that remembered steadier times. She'd idolized Jesse Owens as a child, had written school reports about the man who'd stood tall in Hitler's backyard and proved American excellence. When Jesse died in 1980, 12-year-old Sarah had cried herself to sleep. How could Frank explain that her hero had been human, desperate, willing to compromise everything for love? The coffee smell from his shattered mug still lingered, mixing with the apartment's familiar cocktail of developer chemicals and old paper. This place had been his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude where secrets aged like wine in darkness. But sanctuaries could become prisons. Frank understood that now, feeling the walls close tighter with each labored breath. Mrs. Chen's Pomeranian had gone silent next door, and the silence felt ominous. Frank returned to the window, adjusting the blinds with practiced caution. The black sedan had moved closer, now parked directly across from his building. Professional surveillance, too obvious to be amateur, too bold to be coincidence. Frank's mouth went dry. In 70 years of keeping dangerous secrets, he'd developed instincts about being watched. His phone sat on the kitchen counter like an unexploded bomb. Dr. Elena Richter would call again. They always called again, these historians and journalists who thought truth was a noble pursuit, who never considered the collateral damage of revelation. Frank had met dozens of them over the decades, earnest seekers who'd stumbled onto fragments of his secret, who'd needed careful discouraging or strategic misdirection. But Elena sounded different, confident. She had footage, archives, evidence Frank couldn't dismiss or explain away, and she had a timeline, 36 hours before broadcast. Before Jesse Owens became a cautionary tale instead of an inspiration. Frank's chest tightened again as he imagined Sarah watching that documentary, struggling to understand how her childhood hero had traded dignity for family safety. Would her damaged mind be able to process such betrayal? Or would it shatter what remained of her connection to joy, to hope, to the father who'd spent decades spinning noble lies? The negatives lay scattered on his kitchen table like tarot cards predicting doom. Each strip contained moments of moral complexity that the world wasn't ready to understand. Jesse accepting the envelope. Jesse's tears afterward, the weight of impossible choice etched in every line of his face. Jesse making Frank promise to protect his family's ignorance, to let his daughters grow up believing their father was purely heroic. "Promise me, Frank," Jesse had whispered in that Berlin hotel room, his hands shaking as he counted the money that would buy his children's safety. "Whatever happens, don't let them know what I had to do. Let them be proud." Frank had kept that promise through Jesse's poverty, through his struggles with alcoholism, through his death. He'd kept it through Maria's cancer, through Sarah's stroke, through 8 decades of silence that had calcified around his heart like scar tissue. But promises to the dead became heavier with time, and Frank could feel this one crushing what remained of his soul. The black sedan's engine started outside, a low rumble that vibrated through the building's bones. Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of history and love and impossible choices pressing down like accumulated snow. Whatever came next would destroy someone he cared about. The only question was whom he would choose to sacrifice. The sedan pulled away from the curb, but Frank knew it would be back. They always came back. He was reaching for his pills when the knock came, 3 measured raps on his apartment door, each one echoing through the cluttered rooms like gunshots. Frank froze, the nitroglycerin bottle halfway to his mouth. In 30 years at this address, unannounced visitors had brought only bad news. The police, when Maria collapsed in the grocery store, the hospital social worker, when Sarah's stroke left her unable to speak her own name. Death and catastrophe announced themselves with knocking. "Mr. Morrison?" A woman's voice accented. "German. My name is Elena Richter. I believe we spoke on the phone." Frank's blood turned to ice water. Elena Richter was supposed to be in Berlin, supposed to be 3,000 miles away preparing her documentary, but she was here, on the other side of his door, close enough to touch the negatives that could destroy everything. He swept the film strips into their canister with shaking hands, screwing the lid tight, as if that could contain the explosion building inside his chest. The photographs on his shrine seemed to watch him with accusatory eyes. Maria, who'd died believing her husband was an honest man. Sarah, who'd built her career on truth-telling and would be shattered to learn her father had spent decades protecting lies. "I know you're in there, Mr. Morrison. Your neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was very helpful. She mentioned you've lived here since 1993, that you're a photographer. Former war correspondent, she thinks. Another knock, more insistent. I've come a very long way to speak with you." Frank pressed his back against the kitchen wall, mind racing. Elena couldn't know about the negatives. If she had concrete proof, she wouldn't need him. She was fishing, following leads that had somehow connected Heinrich Müller to Jesse Owens, to a Chicago photographer who'd been present that night in Berlin. But how much did she actually know? Frank's hands found the canister, clutching it like a rosary. Inside lay evidence of Jesse's deal with the Gestapo. Photographs that showed America's greatest Olympic hero accepting Nazi money to ensure his daughters wouldn't disappear into the night like so many other black children who dared to shine too brightly. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your reluctance, but I have footage from the Bundesarchiv showing Jesse Owens entering the Adlon Hotel on the night of August 4th, 1936. Surveillance film the Nazis kept of their negotiations. I know what happened in that room. The words hit Frank like physical blows. Surveillance footage. Christ! He'd never considered that the Nazis might have been filming their own blackmail operation. He'd been so focused on protecting his photographs that he'd never imagined other cameras, other evidence emerging from archives he couldn't control. His legs gave out, and Frank slid down the wall until he was sitting on the linoleum floor where his coffee had shattered hours ago. The smell of old spills and chemical developer seemed overwhelming now, the apartment's protective walls dissolving around him like mist. The footage shows Jesse entering room 412 at 11:17 p.m. Elena continued, her voice carrying clearly through the thin door. Heinrich Müller was already inside, waiting. They spoke for 37 minutes. When Jesse left, he was carrying an envelope. Frank closed his eyes, transported back to that sweltering Berlin night. He'd followed Jesse to the hotel against orders, had hidden in the service corridor with his camera when Müller's men intercepted him. The conversation had been in English, Müller's cold voice explaining how easily a Negro athlete's family could meet with accidents back in America, how the fatherland could ensure their protection for a reasonable price. "What I don't have," Elena said, and Frank heard her settling against the door as if prepared to wait, "is audio. The surveillance system was visual only. I can see what happened, but I can't hear what was said. I can't prove Jesse was coerced rather than complicit." Frank's breath caught. She didn't know. Elena had the skeleton of the story, but none of its heart, none of the desperate love that had driven Jesse to shake hands with monsters. Without audio, without context, the footage would show only collaboration, Jesse Owens appearing to willingly accept Nazi money. The truth was somehow worse than Elena's incomplete evidence. The world would see Jesse as a traitor instead of a father making an impossible choice. Frank's photographs could provide that context, could show Jesse's tears afterward, could preserve some fragment of the man's dignity even in revelation. But they would still destroy Sarah, still shatter every pure memory of the hero who'd inspired a little girl to believe in justice. Frank pressed the canister to his chest, feeling the weight of 8 decades collapsing into this single moment. Outside his door sat a woman with the power to rewrite history. Inside his hands lay the evidence that could save Jesse's reputation or damn it completely. The equilibrium of his hidden life had shattered like his coffee mug, and Frank Morrison could never go back to silence again. Frank remained on the kitchen floor, his back against the wall, listening to Elena's breathing through the door. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, each second adding weight to decisions he wasn't ready to make. His arthritis complained about the cold linoleum, but moving felt impossible, as if standing would somehow commit him to a path he couldn't retreat from. "I can wait," Elena said finally, her voice softer now. "I have nowhere else to be." That was a lie. Documentary filmmakers didn't fly across oceans to sit in Chicago hallways without backup plans. Frank's fingers traced the canister's edges, feeling the metal grow warm under his touch. Elena needed him, which meant she was more desperate than she sounded. But desperation made people dangerous. The phone rang, splitting the apartment's tension like an axe blow. Frank's answering machine clicked on after 4 rings. "You've reached Frank Morrison. Leave a message." "Grandpa Frank?" The voice was tentative, fragile. "Sarah. The nurses said I could call. I had a good morning, remembered your birthday is next month. Are you there?" Frank's heart seized. Sarah rarely called, and her speech was usually too fragmented for phone conversations. Today must be one of her clear days, a cruel gift that would make whatever came next even more devastating. He could hear Elena shift outside the door, probably recognizing the vulnerability in Sarah's voice. "I wanted to tell you," Sarah continued, words coming slowly but precisely. "I've been reading about Jesse Owens again. Do you remember when I was little how I wanted to run like him? The nurses here, they don't understand why he matters. They think he's just ancient history." Frank squeezed his eyes shut. Sarah's childhood obsession with Jesse had driven her to journalism, to a career built on believing that truth and justice were the same thing. How could he explain that sometimes truth was a weapon aimed at the innocent? Anyway, I love you, Grandpa Frank. Call me back when you can. The line went dead. Elena had heard every word, and Frank could feel her processing this new information. His granddaughter. Another person who would be collateral damage if this story exploded. She sounds lovely, Elena said through the door. Recovering from something? Frank didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Elena was profiling him now, cataloguing weaknesses and pressure points. Every good investigator learned to read between the lines, to understand what people protected and why. His phone rang again. This time Frank lunged for it, desperate to prevent another emotional ambush, but the machine picked up first. A different voice, male, older. Frank, this is Harold Steinberg. We need to talk. Frank's blood turned to sludge. Harold Steinberg, his editor from the Tribune, retired now for 15 years but still connected to every important conversation in Chicago journalism. If Harold was calling, word was already spreading through networks Frank couldn't control. I just got off the phone with someone from the History Channel, Harold continued. They're asking questions about 1936, about photographers who covered the Berlin Olympics. Your name came up. Frank, if you're sitting on something big, you need to think carefully about how this plays out. Call me. Elena knocked again, 3 sharp raps. Mr. Morrison, it seems your old colleagues are concerned. Perhaps we should discuss this before more people become involved. Frank struggled to his feet, joints protesting every movement. Through his window, the street looked different now. More cars parked at odd angles, a utility van that hadn't been there this morning. 2 men in suits talking by the corner bodega. Either his paranoia was accelerating or Elena hadn't come to Chicago alone. I know you're protecting someone, Elena said. The way you hesitated when I mentioned the envelope, the photographs I can see through your window. You were there that night, weren't you? You saw what happened between Jesse and Muller. Frank's reflection stared back from the kitchen window, an old man caught between impossible choices. He looked like his father had at the end, hollow-eyed, burdened by secrets that had calcified into physical pain. Frank had sworn he'd never become that kind of man, had promised himself he'd live honestly, but promises to the living were harder to keep than promises to the dead. I have funding for a follow-up documentary, Elena continued. Your story could be told with dignity, with context. But if I have to piece this together from Nazi archives and speculation, the narrative becomes much darker. Is that what Jesse would have wanted? Frank pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Elena was good. She understood exactly which buttons to push, how to frame collaboration as protection. But she was also wrong about one crucial thing. This wasn't about what Jesse would have wanted. Jesse was beyond wanting anything. This was about Sarah, about preserving what remained of an old man's family from the wreckage of historical truth. And Frank Morrison was running out of time to choose who would survive the blast. Frank turned the deadbolt with fingers that felt detached from his body. The mechanism clicked like a bone breaking, final and irreversible. Elena Richter stood in his doorway, smaller than he'd imagined, but carrying herself with the coiled intensity of a predator. Her eyes swept past him immediately, cataloguing the apartment's contents with professional efficiency. Thank you, she said, stepping inside without invitation. Her gaze locked onto the photographs scattered across his kitchen table, the film canisters arranged like evidence at a crime scene. Those are from Berlin. It wasn't a question. Frank watched her approach his makeshift darkroom setup, noting how she moved carefully around the developer trays, respecting the tools even as she violated his sanctuary. She understood photography, understood what she was seeing. That made her infinitely more dangerous. 36 hours, Frank said, closing the door behind her. That's what you told me on the phone. Actually, we're down to 34 now. Elena picked up one of the canisters, weighing it in her palm. These have been sitting here for decades, haven't they? Undeveloped, like time bombs waiting to explode. Frank's chest tightened. The nitroglycerine pills sat on the counter just feet away, but reaching for them would show weakness. Elena was testing him, watching for pressure points. He forced his breathing to steady, drawing on reserves of composure that had carried him through war zones and death scenes. Show me, he said. Elena reached into her messenger bag and withdrew a laptop, setting it on his kitchen table beside the photographs of Maria and Sarah. The juxtaposition felt obscene, his family's innocent faces next to the machine that would destroy their peace. She opened a video file, and grainy surveillance footage filled the screen. Frank recognized the Adlon Hotel's lobby immediately, though the image quality was poor, shadows and harsh lighting creating a noir atmosphere that felt appropriate for what he was about to witness. The timestamp read August 4th, 1936, 11:15 p.m. Two figures moved across the frame, Jesse Owens, unmistakable even in the degraded footage, and Heinrich Müller, his pale bulk dominating the screen. "Watch Jesse's hands," Elena said softly. Frank did, though he didn't need to. He'd been there, hidden in the service corridor with his camera pressed against his chest, watching the greatest athlete in the world reduced to a terrified father. On screen, Jesse's hands shook as he spoke with Müller. Even without audio, his desperation was visible in every gesture. The meeting lasted 37 minutes, Elena continued. "This is the end." Jesse emerged from the elevator alone, carrying a manila envelope. He moved like a man in physical pain, shoulders hunched, as if carrying invisible weight. At the hotel's entrance, he paused and looked directly up at the surveillance camera. A moment of such raw anguish that Frank had to look away. "That's when you took your photographs," Elena said. "After he left the hotel, you followed him." Frank nodded slowly. "To the park across the street. He sat on a bench and counted the money. Then he threw up in the bushes. The money was for his daughter's protection?" Müller made it clear what would happen if Jesse refused to cooperate. Accidents happened to Negro children in America, house fires, car crashes. The Reich had friends everywhere, even in Cleveland. Frank's voice felt like gravel. Jesse had two little girls. Gloria was 8, Marlene was 6, the same age as Sarah when she used to write school reports about him. Elena closed the laptop, her expression unreadable. "You've been protecting this secret for 88 years. I've been protecting Jesse's daughters, then their children, now their grandchildren." Frank gestured towards Sarah's photograph. "And I've been protecting her. Every child who ever looked up to Jesse Owens and believed that heroes existed. But the cost is mine to pay." Frank's voice cracked. "Do you have children, Miss Richter?" "No." "Then you can't understand what Jesse felt in that room, what any parent would feel, faced with that choice." Frank picked up the canister containing his negatives, cradling it like a wounded bird. He wasn't a collaborator. He was a father who loved his children more than his reputation. Elena studied him with forensic intensity. "The surveillance footage shows collaboration without context. Your photographs could provide that context, couldn't they? Show his emotional state, prove he was coerced?" Frank's hands trembled around the canister. She was right. His photographs could transform the narrative from betrayal to tragedy, could preserve some fragment of Jesse's heroism even in revelation, but they would still destroy the myth that had sustained generations of dreamers. "My granddaughter is dying," Frank said quietly. "Slowly, piece by piece. Some days she doesn't remember her own name, but she still remembers Jesse Owens, still believes in the man who stood tall in Hitler's backyard." He looked at Sarah's graduation photograph, her proud smile radiant with hope. "What gives you the right to take that away from her?" Elena's composure finally cracked, revealing something that might have been guilt. "What gives you the right to decide what the world deserves to know?" Outside, Frank heard car doors slamming, footsteps on his building's front steps. Elena's backup team was moving into position, and his window for choice was closing like a trap. The walls of his sanctuary felt thinner now, as if decades of accumulated secrets had finally eaten through the foundation. Frank Morrison had run out of time to protect everyone he loved. Someone was going to burn. The footsteps in the hallway stopped outside Frank's door. 3 sharp knocks, then a voice he didn't recognize. Young, male, impatient. "Elena, we need to move. The Tribune's sending someone over." Elena's face went pale, her professional mask slipping completely. "That wasn't supposed to happen yet," she muttered, then louder, 5 more minutes, Marcus." Frank felt the world tilt sideways. "You told them," he whispered. You already contacted the media. I had to establish credibility, show them I had sources, before you even spoke to me. The betrayal hit Frank like a physical blow. This whole conversation, this performance about context and dignity, you'd already decided. Elena backed toward the door, her laptop clutched against her chest. Frank, you have to understand. I'm not the only one investigating this. If I don't break the story properly, someone else will do it wrong. At least I'm trying to... Get out! Frank's voice came from some primal place he'd forgotten existed. Get out of my home! But Elena wasn't moving fast enough, because the footsteps were returning, multiple sets now, and Frank heard his building's front door open with the electronic buzz that meant someone had pressed all the apartment buttons until a neighbor let them in. The sound of his sanctuary being violated. Mr. Morrison? A new voice in the hallway, authoritative, familiar. This is Detective Ray Kowalski, Chicago PD. We need to speak with you about stolen Nazi documents. Frank's legs nearly gave out. Stolen documents. That meant Elena had lied about everything. She wasn't just a documentary filmmaker with archive footage. She was trafficking in stolen materials, and now she'd made Frank an accessory by association. You used me, he said, staring at Elena with dawning horror. You needed a legitimate source to authenticate your stolen footage. Someone who was actually there. Elena's composure cracked completely. The documents are historically significant. They belong in the public. They belong in archives, not in your hands for profit. Frank clutched the canister tighter. How many people have you contacted? How many media outlets? Frank, I'm trying to protect Jesse's legacy. No. The word exploded from Frank with 8 decades of suppressed fury. You're trying to build your career on his corpse. The revelation rewrote everything that had happened in the past hour. Elena's careful questions, her emotional manipulation, her claims about funding and follow-up documentaries, all lies designed to extract information Frank would never have given willingly. She'd studied him, learned about Sarah, crafted the perfect approach to crack open his defenses. Mr. Morrison, please open the door. Detective Kowalski's voice carried the weight of inevitable authority. We know you have a visitor. This will go easier if you cooperate. Frank looked at Elena, seeing her clearly for the first time. Young, ambitious, convinced of her own righteousness. She believed she was serving history, but she was really serving herself. The same arrogance that had driven 1,000 war correspondents Frank had known. People who confused their hunger for truth with actual virtue. You want to know what Jesse told me? Frank said quietly. The night after his meeting with Muller? Elena nodded eagerly, unable to help herself even as the police knocked again. He said the hardest part wasn't taking the money. It was knowing he'd have to live with people like you for the rest of his life. People who would judge his choice without understanding the stakes. People who would reduce a father's love to a footnote in their own ambitions. Elena's face went white. I'm not. You came here with stolen evidence, lied about your intentions, manipulated information about my dying granddaughter, and called the police before you even spoke to me. Frank's voice carried the quiet fury of a man with nothing left to lose. But you still think you're the hero of this story? The door shuddered under heavy knocks. Mr. Morrison, we're coming in. Elena moved toward the window, but Frank stepped between her and escape. No. You wanted the truth so badly? Here it is. Jesse Owens was a better man than either of us will ever be, and he'd be ashamed to know what his sacrifice had come to. A confused old man and a thief fighting over his bones. Frank walked to the door and turned the lock, accepting what came next. But he kept the canister pressed against his chest, the last secret Elena would never steal. The final piece of Jesse's dignity she couldn't monetize. As the door swung open and uniforms flooded his sanctuary, Frank Morrison realized he'd been protecting the wrong thing all along. He should have been protecting himself. Detective Kowalski filled Frank's doorway like a wall of bureaucratic inevitability. Thick shoulders, graying mustache, the tired eyes of a man who'd spent 30 years cleaning up other people's messes. Behind him, 2 uniformed officers flanked Elena, who had gone perfectly still in the way that guilty people do when their lies finally catch up with them. Mr. Morrison, Kowalski said, his voice carrying the weary patience of someone used to dealing with elderly witnesses. We need to discuss some documents that may have been stolen from the Berlin State Archive. Ms. Richter here claims you can authenticate their historical significance. Frank felt his world continue its sideways slide into chaos. Through the detective's legs, he could see more people in the hallway. Marcus, Elena's colleague, frantically typing on his phone, and someone else with a camera bag who looked suspiciously like press. Elena hadn't just betrayed him, she'd orchestrated a media circus. I've never seen any stolen documents, Frank said carefully, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Elena stepped forward, desperation finally cracking her professional veneer completely. Detective! Mr. Morrison is confused. He's been hiding photographs from the 1936 Olympics for decades. Photographs that could vindicate Jesse Owens instead of destroying him. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Frank watched Kowalski's expression shift as he processed what Elena had just revealed. Not just that Frank possessed significant historical materials, but that he'd been concealing them for nearly 90 years. The detective's tired eyes sharpened with the scent of a much bigger story. Is that true, sir? Kowalski asked. Do you have unpublished photographs from the Berlin Olympics? Frank's grip on the canister tightened until his arthritic knuckles screamed. This was the moment, the absolute point of no return Elena had been maneuvering him toward since she'd first called. Every word he spoke now would either damn Jesse's memory or destroy his own remaining years in legal battles and media scrutiny. But as he looked at Elena's face, at the calculating hunger barely hidden beneath her false concern, Frank realized something that cut through his confusion like a blade. He was tired of being afraid. Yes, he said quietly, I have photographs. Elena's eyes lit up with triumph, but Frank wasn't finished. Photographs of a young man being extorted by Nazis. Photographs of a father choosing his children's lives over his own reputation. Photographs that would break the heart of every child who ever believed heroes could exist in an evil world. Frank walked to his kitchen table and set down the canister next to Sarah's graduation picture. His movements felt ceremonial, like a priest handling sacred relics. You want to see Jesse Owens reduced to his worst moment? You want to transform him from a symbol of courage into a footnote about moral compromise? Detective Kowalski shifted uncomfortably. Frank could see the man calculating political ramifications, imagining the media firestorm that would erupt if Chicago PD was seen as complicit in destroying an American icon's legacy. But Elena sensed her opportunity, slipping away, and pressed forward with renewed desperation. Mr. Morrison, you're not thinking clearly, she said. These photographs could prove Jesse was coerced. They could show his humanity instead of hiding it. The truth doesn't always destroy, sometimes it redeems. Frank laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Redemption? You think there's redemption in watching a hero count blood money? In seeing the greatest athlete in history reduced to a terrified father begging for his children's lives? His phone rang again, cutting through the tension like a scream. Frank glanced at the caller ID and felt his heart stop. Sarah's nursing home. On her clear days, Sarah sometimes became agitated in the evenings, confused about where she was or why Frank hadn't visited. The staff would call when she became inconsolable, when she needed to hear his voice to find her way back to calm. Frank stared at the ringing phone, then at Elena's predatory face, then at Detective Kowalski's badge gleaming under his apartment's harsh fluorescent light. Three forces pulling at him: his dying granddaughter's need, Elena's ambition, and the law's indifferent machinery. For 88 years, Frank had chosen silence. He'd swallowed Jesse's secret like poison, let it burn through his insides, rather than contaminate the world with its toxicity. He'd protected everyone except himself, sacrificed his own peace for the greater good of preserved mythology. But now, watching Elena manipulate even the police to serve her agenda, Frank Morrison realized the fundamental truth that had eluded him for nearly 9 decades. Some secrets weren't meant to protect the dead. They were meant to protect the living from the truth that heroes were just people, that courage was just fear with better timing, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to let evil destroy everything you loved. The phone continued ringing, Sarah's need pulling at him across the dark city. Frank picked up the canister and made his choice. Frank answered the phone. "Grandpa Frank?" Sarah's voice came through the speaker, thin and confused but unmistakably present, one of her clear moments, breaking through the fog of medication and memory loss like sunlight through storm clouds. "I had the strangest dream. Jesse Owens was here, and he looked so sad." The room fell silent. Detective Kowalski, Elena, the uniformed officers, all of them frozen as Frank's private world collided with their professional ambitions. Frank closed his eyes, feeling Sarah's voice anchor him to what truly mattered. "I'm here, sweetheart," Frank said softly. "Tell me about the dream." He was young again, like in your old photographs. But he was crying, Grandpa. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over. Why would Jesse Owens be sorry? Frank looked directly at Elena as he answered. "Because sometimes, Sarah, even heroes have to make impossible choices, and sometimes they carry guilt that was never theirs to bear." Elena's face went ashen. She finally understood what Frank had been protecting, not just Jesse's reputation, but the dying dreams of a granddaughter who needed heroes more than historians needed truth. "Will you visit me tomorrow?" Sarah asked. "I want to show you my new drawing. It's Jesse running, with wings like an angel." "I'll be there," Frank promised, his voice breaking. "I love you, sweetheart." "Love you too, Grandpa Frank." The line went dead, leaving Frank standing in a room full of strangers who had just witnessed something sacred. He set the phone down with trembling hands, then turned to face Elena with a composure that surprised even himself. "That," he said quietly, "is who you're really trying to destroy. Not Jesse Owens, not some abstract historical truth. Her, a dying young woman whose last clear memories include believing that good can triumph over evil." Elena's professional mask finally shattered completely. "Frank, I never meant—" "Yes, you did." Frank's voice carried 8 decades of accumulated wisdom and pain. "You meant exactly this. You just convinced yourself it was noble." He walked to Detective Kowalski, still clutching the canister. "Detective, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. These photographs show Jesse Owens in his most vulnerable moment. They show a father being extorted by Nazis, choosing his children's safety over his own honor. They are historically significant, morally complex, and absolutely devastating." Kowalski nodded slowly, his expression grave. "They are also mine," Frank continued. "I took them with my own camera, developed them with my own hands, and have kept them private for 88 years. No one stole them from any archive because they were never in any archive. They have been in my possession continuously since 1936. Elena stepped forward desperately. "But the surveillance footage—" "Which you obtained illegally from German archives," Frank said, cutting her off. "Which you've been using to blackmail me into authenticating your stolen materials, which you've already distributed to media outlets without my consent or cooperation." Detective Kowalski's tired eyes sharpened as he reassessed the situation. "Ms. Richter, is this accurate? Are you in possession of stolen archival materials?" Elena's silence was answer enough. Frank opened the canister for the first time in decades, revealing the negatives inside like dark secrets finally exposed to light. But instead of handing them over, he held them up so everyone could see their fragile, translucent forms. "Jesse Owens was 19 years old when he broke 3 world records in one afternoon," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of witnessed history. "He was 22 when he won 4 gold medals in Hitler's backyard. He was 23 when Heinrich Müller threatened his daughter's lives, and he made the choice that haunts these photographs." Frank's hands began to shake, but his voice remained steady. He was a man, not a myth. He was brave, not because he was perfect, but because he found courage despite his terror, and he trusted me to protect that complexity, that humanity, that terrible proof that heroes are just people who refuse to let evil win. Elena made one final, desperate attempt. "Frank, please, the world needs to know—" The world needs to know what Jesse Owens showed them in those 4 races, Frank interrupted. That's the truth that matters. That's the legacy worth preserving. He looked down at the negatives in his hands, images that had consumed his life, poisoned his peace, and protected Sarah's dreams for nearly 9 decades. Then he walked to his kitchen sink and turned on the gas burner. "Mr. Morrison, don't," Kowalski said sharply. But Frank had already held the negatives over the flame. 88 years of secrets curled and blackened and disappeared into smoke, taking Jesse's worst moment with them and leaving only his best. "Some choices," Frank said, as the last negative dissolved, "are worth making twice." Elena collapsed into his kitchen chair, finally understanding that her ambitions had died with Jesse's darkest hour. Frank Morrison had chosen love over truth, and he was finally at peace. The smoke dissipated slowly, carrying with it the ghosts that had haunted Frank Morrison's dreams for 88 years. In the sudden quiet of his kitchen, the only sound was Elena's soft weeping. Not the tears of a frustrated journalist, but of someone finally understanding the weight of what she'd tried to destroy. Detective Kowalski cleared his throat, breaking the sacred silence. "Mr. Morrison, I'll need you to come in tomorrow to give a formal statement about the stolen archive materials, but—" He glanced at the empty space above the stove where history had just dissolved. "I think we're done here tonight." Elena looked up from the chair, mascara streaking her cheeks. "I had 12 media outlets standing by. CNN, The Times, The Post. They're expecting you to deliver stolen goods," Kowalski said firmly. "I'd suggest you call your lawyer instead." As the police filed out, Elena lingered in Frank's doorway like a penitent seeking absolution. "I really thought I was protecting his legacy," she whispered. Frank studied her face, young, ambitious, broken by the collision between idealism and reality. He recognized something of his own younger self in her desperate certainty, the conviction that truth was always noble regardless of its consequences. "Jesse told me something else that night," Frank said quietly. "He said the hardest part about growing up wasn't learning that heroes had flaws. It was learning that sometimes love matters more than truth." Elena nodded wordlessly and left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway like a funeral march for her abandoned documentary. Frank closed his door and turned to face his empty apartment. The absence of secrets felt strange, like walking into a familiar room after someone had rearranged all the furniture. For the first time in nearly 9 decades, he had nothing to hide, nothing to protect except his memories of a friend who'd trusted him with impossible choices. He made tea with hands that no longer trembled, then sat at his kitchen table beside Sarah's graduation photograph. Outside his window, Chicago stretched toward the horizon like a constellation of earthbound stars, millions of people living their own complicated truths. Somewhere among them, Elena was probably crafting explanations for her editors. Somewhere else, Detective Kowalski was filling out reports about an old man who'd chosen love over evidence. Frank thought about Sarah in her nursing home bed, dreaming of Jesse Owens with angel wings. Tomorrow, he would visit her as promised, and if she was having a clear day, he might tell her about Jesse's daughter Ruth, who had grown up to become a teacher. He might mention how Jesse never stopped running, not from his choices, but toward a future where children could believe in the power of human courage. The phone rang again, startling Frank from his reverie. This time it was his neighbor Mrs. Chen from down the hall. "Frank? I heard voices earlier. Are you all right?" The simple kindness in her question nearly undid him. When had he last allowed anyone to worry about him? When had he last permitted himself the luxury of being cared for instead of protecting everyone else? "I'm fine, Margaret. Better than I've been in years, actually. Well, if you need anything, I know. Thank you." After hanging up, Frank walked to his bedroom closet and retrieved a small wooden box from the top shelf, Jesse's last gift to him, presented at the train station in Berlin as they prepared to return to America. Inside was a single photograph, one Frank had taken himself but never hidden, Jesse crossing the finish line of the 200-meter race, arms raised in triumph, his face radiant with pure joy. This was the Jesse Owens the world needed to remember. Not the terrified father counting Nazi bribes, but the young man who had run faster than hate itself, who had proved that excellence transcended the small cruelties of evil men. Frank placed the photograph on his kitchen table next to Sarah's picture. Two generations of dreams separated by decades, but connected by the simple belief that goodness could outrun darkness. Tomorrow, he would frame it properly. Tomorrow, he would begin remembering Jesse the way Jesse deserved to be remembered. But tonight, Frank Morrison simply sat in his quiet apartment, drinking tea and watching the city lights flicker like distant beacons. For the first time since 1936, he felt the peculiar lightness that comes from keeping only the promises worth keeping, from protecting only the truths worth saving. In the morning, he would visit Sarah and show her Jesse's triumph. He would hold her hand as she drew her pictures of heroes with wings, and he would know that some stories were too precious for history books, too sacred for documentary films. Some stories belonged only to the people who loved them enough to keep them safe. Frank smiled, tasting freedom in his tea, and finally allowed himself to rest.